This is a story about love, loss, and the long road back to light. My son Ryder was born still after what seemed to be a healthy, full-term, uneventful pregnancy. Nothing prepared us for that day or for everything that followed. In this podcast, I'll take you through the moments leading up to his passing, the immediate aftermath, and the reality of learning how to survive something that feels impossible to survive. I'll show you how I slowly found my footing again, how joy eventually made its way back into my life, and where I am today. This is not medical advice, and I'm not a therapist or healthcare professional. These are my experiences, my perspectives, and my truth. If you are walking a similar path, I encourage you to seek guidance from your care providers and find what works best for you. But this is my story, and if you're here, I hope that somewhere within it, you find a little bit of hope. Last episode, we ended on those unexpected gut punches, the ones that come out of nowhere and take the air right out of you. I shared a simple trip to Target, walking past an Easter display and suddenly being hit with the reality that our son wasn't there. Those moments were everywhere, and Ann and I could feel it. We weren't just grieving, we were headed into the fight of our lives, not just individually, but in our relationship too. We were up against waves of sadness, depression, and this growing sense of disconnection from each other that I don't think either one of us really knew was there. We were so dependent on each other emotionally and physically. We needed to be next to each other at every waking moment, but it was all around the loss of our son, all that immense grief, and not necessarily around our need for ourselves or our relationship. And it became clear pretty quickly we weren't going to get through this on our own. In a lot of ways, our relationship was so incredibly strong, getting stronger in the loss, but everything was in that space. Everything was in that grief, in that sadness. And that's where therapy came in and why it became such an important part of our story. If you're going through this type of loss or any loss, especially out of order loss, where it's so completely unnatural, I think therapy is a necessity. And Ann and I did it all. We did individual therapy, we did couples therapy, and we did group therapy. We found therapists we love. We found therapists we didn't love. And then we found groups that became friends and almost somewhat of a family. And we will definitely go into all of those things. The first step was finding individual therapists, which we both did. And we started going to the same therapist, just separately, which was good in theory. It was a male therapist, so it worked for me. Did not work as well for Ann, and so quickly pivoted from that. But therapy, individual therapy, was so important, especially for me as the husband and as the father. I think society gives us these rules, these stigmas where the guy has to be the strong one. Can't cry, can't break down, need to hold it together. And so I was in this space where I felt I was walking on eggshells all of the time. If Ann was an 8 on the grief scale that day, I needed to be a 6 at best or lower, because I needed to show up for her and walk her through this journey as a pillar of support, as the strong person. And so it didn't matter where I needed to be. I needed to show up for her in a lowered grief space, a lower amount of sadness, more put together than maybe I was. That's not something that she said. It's not something she expected. But in my own mind and in my experience in conversations over the last several years with others, this is where a lot of us men are in this journey. We feel this way. We can only be so sad, or we cannot overtake our wife in grief. And so this led us to therapy, and we definitely talked through those things, both separately, together, and then in a group. I will say not every type of therapy works for everyone. Again, not a therapist. I will say for Ann and I, we found the most comfort in our group therapy sessions. We found a fantastic group, and I think that matters. I think that's important, where we defined loss is loss is loss. So our loss of Ryder, full-term, healthy pregnancy, was not to be equated or overshadowed or undermined by the loss of somebody in that group who was dealing with infertility, who had lost multiple pregnancies, but early on, or anywhere in between. And there were individuals in that group that ran the gamut of all different types of loss around maternal fetal health, stillbirth like us, sudden infant death syndrome, or where they had a baby and everything seemed to be going perfect, and then all of a sudden that baby passed. We had met all kinds of individuals in those group sessions. What made this group so perfect and unique is that not only did we all have our own stories, and we all legitimately started to care for one another, but the therapists that led the sessions all also had their own stories of loss. So they were in it with us as well. So when you talk about empathy and getting in the hole with that person, they were there. They were already there before us. They were there. They were in that hole when Anna and I walked in that first week. And so it was a very loving space. It was a very empathetic space. Everybody knew each other's stories. They knew each other's babies' names. We said them all of the time. Every session, we were this group's best cheerleaders. We were their shoulders to cry on. They were ours. And it really became a cornerstone of Anna and I's relationship in our life at the time. I don't think we would have survived without our group therapy sessions. The individual therapy sessions were good, not great. They were less about the content and more about the number of times I was going to see him from a billing perspective. But we leaned really hard into the group sessions. We also did some couple sessions as well, but the group is where we really dove in because everyone understood where we were at. And there was this space where grief took over everything in our lives. We didn't laugh. We didn't smile. The joy was gone. Everything was tears and sadness. And if by some miracle of the day something happened where we laughed or we found joy for a moment, it then came with this flood of intense guilt that we didn't love our son enough. We didn't feel sad enough that he had passed, that we were moving on too quickly. None of those things were true. But anytime there was that joy or that happiness, it was this tidal wave of anxiety and grief that just kicked your ass after the fact. And this group, they had all sat in our seat. They had all shared our story in their own way. And so they had all walked this journey and we're still walking it at the same time. And so it was super helpful and super powerful to hear those stories, to be reaffirmed and like, hey, we've all been there. You're not doing anything wrong. It is okay to laugh. It is okay to smile. It is okay to plan a trip and do the things that you normally would do in life. It is okay to live your life and still be sad that your son passed at the same time. And group therapy was monumental in that. I cannot speak to that or applaud that, be a cheerleader for that enough. If you are in this space and you are looking for support, I would look at your resources for a lost group in your area. It does not need to be through a church. Ours was not religious based at all. And it had people from all different walks of life. You can find them. Hospitals can give resources. I mean, you can Google things online, ChatGPT at this point, but in your communities, you can look for lost groups that are ran by licensed therapists. Most of them, to my knowledge, are free to attend. Ours was. And I think this is Again, I'm not a healthcare professional. I'm not a psychologist, not a psychiatrist, but in our experience, this was the best way to kind of learn how to live again and to feel okay with it, because it was really an audience of our peers, and we heard their stories. We saw their tears. We heard their babies' names, and they heard ours, and we were not alone. And you need to find your people when you are going through this type of grief, this type of loss. That is super important. That is the best way to ensure survival. And I can tell you, I don't want to go into individuals' names and stories or anything like that, but I can tell you in our group, there were couples that showed up together and talked through it and survived and had other children, found joy, and made it through that season of extreme grief in their life. And there are other couples where they did not show up together. That stigma, most of the time, the men weren't showing up. They were not opening up. They were not being vulnerable. They were not sharing their story. And those couples did not survive. And so I don't want to say one's right, one's wrong, because every relationship is different. And maybe there were other things going on, and I'm sure that there were, but I cannot stress finding a good group where you are comfortable, where you are welcomed, where you can share your story and you can hear others, you can understand that you are not alone in the space, can be super helpful, super meaningful. I've seen it and continue to see it almost 7 years later. We still are part of groups. We don't necessarily go to group therapy sessions any longer, but we work with groups here in our state of Iowa. One of them is No Foot Too Small, which we will get into later in the series. But we have found our people and we have found our community, especially our lost community. And we have invited our friends and our loved ones, our family, into this space with us. And we have all learned, we've all grown from it. I cannot stress, and I keep doing it enough, how important group therapy and just therapy in and of itself was to our survival in this space and our continued survival. Grief is cyclical. So you'll hear about the stages of grief, and these are all real things, but grief is not a straight line. You can be totally fine today and you can hit a brick wall tomorrow. Heck, you could be totally fine right now and something can happen on your way to lunch that triggers you, and then you spiral for the rest of the day. Grief is a son of a bitch. It really is. And you need to combat it as best that you can. And therapy is really the best way to do that. And again, we found a lot of help and support in the group therapy route. So I will leave you on that for today. Heavy session talking about things. Next time, we will dive heavier into finding your people and how people show up in this space and how they don't. So talk to you next time.